On a crisp autumn morning in October 1957, a middle-aged schoolteacher from Des Moines, Iowa, named Margaret Holloway stood on the observation deck of the Empire State Building, her Kodak Brownie camera clutched in trembling hands as she gazed across the Manhattan skyline. The wind whipped at her navy blue coat, the same coat she had worn to her mother's funeral 6 months earlier, and carried with it the scent of exhaust fumes and roasting chestnuts from the street vendors 86 floors below. She had saved for 3 years to afford this trip to New York City, setting aside $15 from each paycheck in an envelope marked New York Fund that she kept hidden in her bedroom dresser. And she intended to capture every precious moment on film. What Margaret believed would be a simple vacation photograph would instead become the thread that unraveled one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil, proving that sometimes the most significant discoveries come from the most unlikely sources. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Margaret Holloway had lived her entire 43 years in Des Moines, teaching 5th grade at Roosevelt Elementary School on the corner of 14th Street and Forest Avenue. Her world consisted of lesson plans carefully written in her neat cursive handwriting, parent-teacher conferences held in her classroom that still smelled of chalk dust and pencil shavings, and the comfortable routines of Middle America, where everyone knew their neighbors and life moved at a predictable pace. She had never married, a fact that her mother had mentioned with increasing frequency and disappointment as the years passed, devoting herself instead to her students and her elderly mother, who had suffered a stroke in February and passed away the following spring, surrounded by the scent of lilacs that Margaret had brought from their garden. The inheritance, modest as it was, amounting to exactly $2,300 after the funeral expenses and outstanding debts were settled, finally gave Margaret the opportunity to fulfill a lifelong dream of visiting New York City, a place she had only ever known through photographs in National Geographic and scenes from movies shown at the Paramount Theater on Saturday afternoons. She arrived at Grand Central Terminal on a Thursday afternoon, her single leather suitcase, purchased new for the occasion from Yonkers department store, containing 3 carefully pressed dresses that she had ironed twice to ensure perfection, a wool coat with a small moth hole she had darned so carefully it was nearly invisible, and a dog-eared copy of a guidebook she had borrowed from the Des Moines Public Library, after checking their card catalog 3 times to ensure they had the most recent edition available. The guidebook, published in 1952, was already outdated, its pages yellowed and soft from countless readers' hands. But Margaret studied it each night in her hotel room, as though preparing for the comprehensive final examination she gave her students each May. She had mapped out every museum mentioned in its pages, every landmark described in its somewhat flowery prose, every restaurant recommended with enthusiastic italics, creating a careful itinerary written in her planning notebook with different colored pencils to denote different types of activities. The hotel she had booked, the Gramercy Arms, was a modest establishment on East 23rd Street, its brick facade darkened by decades of city soot, and its small lobby filled with the musty scent of old carpeting and furniture polish. The room she was assigned was on the 4th floor, small enough that Margaret could touch both walls if she extended her arms fully, barely large enough for the narrow bed with its faded floral bedspread and the scarred wooden dresser that listed slightly to the left. But it had a window overlooking the street where she could watch the endless stream of pedestrians and yellow taxicabs flowing past like water in a river. And to Margaret, who had never stayed in a hotel alone, who had spent every night of her life either in her childhood bedroom or the bedroom she had occupied in her mother's house, it felt like a palace filled with possibilities and adventure. The desk clerk, a balding man named Vincent, whose nameplate proclaimed him the night manager, spoke with a thick Brooklyn accent that made Margaret strain to understand his vowels, handed her the brass key numbered 407 with barely a glance, already turning his attention to the next guest in line, a businessman with an expensive leather briefcase who tapped his fingers impatiently on the marble counter. Margaret spent her first 2 days following her guidebook religiously, checking off each completed activity with a small pencil mark that gave her a sense of accomplishment. She visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art, climbing the grand stone steps flanked by columns that made her feel tiny and insignificant, where she stood transfixed before the Egyptian wing for nearly 2 hours, studying the hieroglyphics on sarcophagi that had been old when Rome was young, imagining her students' faces if she could somehow transport these ancient treasures back to Iowa and display them in the gymnasium during the annual science fair. She walked through Central Park on a Friday afternoon when golden sunlight filtered through trees ablaze with autumn colors, feeding pigeons near Bethesda Fountain from a small bag of breadcrumbs she had saved from breakfast, watching children in wool coats and knit caps sail toy boats with bright canvas sails in the conservatory water while their mothers chatted on nearby benches. She ate lunch at an automat on 42nd Street, marveling at the novelty of retrieving a cream cheese and olive sandwich from behind a small glass door after depositing exact change in the slot. Sitting at a small table where she could watch the constant parade of humanity flowing past the windows, everyone seemingly in a tremendous hurry to get somewhere important. On her third day, Saturday morning, when the autumn sun painted the city streets with long shadows, she decided to visit the Empire State Building after eating a solitary breakfast of toast and coffee in a diner where the waitress called her honey and refilled her cup 3 times without being asked. The guidebook had described it as the tallest building in the world, a title it had held with pride since 1931, when it had risen above the Manhattan skyline, like a limestone and steel monument to human ambition. And Margaret was determined to see the city from its observation deck before her vacation ended, and she returned to the familiar flatness of Iowa. She arrived early, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds that the guidebook warned could make the wait for elevators stretch to an hour or more, and rode the express elevator with a handful of other tourists, families mostly with children whose voices echoed in the confined space, their excited faces pressed against the elevator's small window as the floors clicked past with mechanical precision, the numbers ascending with dizzying speed. The observation deck on the 86th floor took her breath away in a way that no photograph in any guidebook could have prepared her for, leaving her momentarily speechless as she gripped the metal railing with both hands. October winds whipped across the open-air platform with a force that made her eyes water, and her carefully pinned hair come loose from its customary bun, and Margaret clutched her favorite hat, a navy blue felt cloche that had belonged to her mother, with one hand while fumbling for her camera with the other, her fingers clumsy in the cold air that smelled of altitude and possibility. The city stretched in every direction below her, a vast geometric grid of buildings and streets that seemed to pulse with energy and purpose even from this dizzying height, making Des Moines seem impossibly small and quaint by comparison. She could see the Chrysler Building's distinctive Art Deco spire gleaming in the morning sunlight to the northeast, its crown of triangular windows catching the light like a jeweled tiara, the Hudson River glinting like a ribbon of hammered silver to the west, and the intricate patchwork of Brooklyn sprawling to the south, its brownstone neighborhoods stretching toward a horizon that seemed to curve with the very roundness of the earth itself. Margaret began taking photographs with the methodical care she brought to all her tasks, carefully composing each shot through the small viewfinder as she had read in a photography magazine she had studied at the public library, making sure the horizon was level and the subject properly framed. She wanted images that would transport her students to this moment when she showed them during her presentation, that would help them understand the immensity and complexity of the world beyond the cornfields and tree-lined streets of Iowa, that would inspire them to dream of their own adventures beyond the familiar boundaries of their small lives. She photographed the skyline with its countless buildings reaching toward the cloudless sky, the river busy with tugboats and barges whose wakes left white trails on the grey water, the tiny cars moving like brightly colored beetles along the streets far below where the sound of their horns and engines could not reach this elevated sanctuary. It was while she was photographing the northern view, carefully focusing on the Chrysler Building, while trying to remember the aperture settings the magazine article had recommended for bright outdoor photography, that she noticed 2 men standing near the northwestern corner of the deck, partially obscured by the metal framework that supported the observation deck's protective fence. They stood close together, closer than strangers typically stood in public spaces, their heads bent in conversation that seemed intense and purposeful, and something about their posture caught her attention in a way she could not immediately articulate. One man was tall and lean, his frame angular beneath a dark overcoat that looked European in cut, wearing a fedora pulled low over his eyes in a manner that seemed calculated to hide his face rather than merely protect against the wind. The other was shorter, stockier, dressed in a brown suit that seemed slightly too large for his frame, as though he had recently lost weight or perhaps purchased it second-hand without proper alterations, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, in a gesture that could have been casual but somehow seemed tense. Margaret thought little of it at first, dismissing her momentary interest as mere curiosity about fellow tourists. The observation deck held perhaps 20 other visitors scattered across its perimeter, couples embracing while they admired the view, families with children pointing excitedly at landmarks they recognized, elderly tourists resting on the benches that lined the interior walls, and people naturally clustered together in conversation throughout the space. But as she adjusted her camera angle, trying to frame the Chrysler Building, without including too much of the foreground railing and the other tourists who kept wandering into her carefully composed shot, the two men moved directly into her viewfinder at precisely the moment she was ready to take the photograph. The taller man was handing something to the shorter one, a gesture so quick and subtle that Margaret almost missed it entirely, the movement practiced and efficient, like dancers who had rehearsed their steps many times before. An envelope, thin and white, and no larger than a businessman's letter, passed from one hand to another in a fluid motion and disappeared into the brown suit jacket, with such speed that someone not looking directly at that moment would never have noticed the exchange had occurred at all. She pressed the shutter release without thinking, her finger acting on instinct before her conscious mind could process what she was seeing, capturing the moment more by accident than design or intention. The camera's mechanical click and the small sound of the internal mechanisms advancing the film were lost completely in the wind that moaned around the building's corners and the chatter of nearby tourists exclaiming over the view. Neither man looked in her direction, gave no sign they were aware they had been photographed. Their attention focused entirely on each other and their clandestine transaction. Margaret moved on to her next photograph, lowering the camera to advance the film manually, thinking nothing more of the exchange beyond a fleeting curiosity. In New York City, she reasoned with the practical common sense she brought to all situations. People conducted business everywhere and at all hours, their lives too busy and complicated to be confined to offices and designated meeting rooms. Perhaps it was a ticket for a show, or a letter of introduction, or a payment for services rendered, or any of 1,000 innocent items that might be transferred between acquaintances on a windy observation deck on a Saturday morning. She spent another 30 minutes on the observation deck, taking photographs with growing confidence until she had used the entire roll of 24 precious exposures, each one a treasured memory she would develop upon her return to Des Moines. She made a mental note to have them processed at Woolworth's, where they offered a special discount if you ordered double prints, allowing her to keep one set for herself and give the duplicates to her students or perhaps send them to her cousin in Cedar Rapids, who had never traveled farther than Chicago. The rest of Margaret's vacation passed in a blur of museums and shows and restaurants that made her feel simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted, each day packed with more experiences than she had accumulated in entire years back home. She saw a Wednesday matinee performance of My Fair Lady at the Mark Hellinger Theatre, sitting in the balcony where the tickets were affordable on her carefully managed budget, with tears streaming down her face during the finale when Eliza returns to Higgins, the emotional power of the performance touching something deep within her that she had not known existed. She visited the Statue of Liberty on a Thursday morning when fog rolled across the harbor, making the iconic figure appear to emerge from clouds like a vision, climbing the stairs inside the pedestal until her legs ached and her lungs burned from the exertion, feeling a surge of patriotic emotion as she gazed out at the city that represented America's promise to the world. She ate her first bagel at a delicatessen on the Lower East Side, the chewy texture and strange hole confusing her until the counterman explained with barely concealed amusement how they were made. Her first niche purchased from a street vendor whose cart filled the corner with the aroma of fried dough and seasoned potatoes. Her first egg cream consumed at a soda fountain where the young man working behind the marble counter created the mysterious chocolate concoction without using any eggs or cream at all. Each new taste a revelation that she catalogued carefully in a small spiral notebook she carried in her purse, alongside her maps and guidebook. By the time she boarded the westbound train back to Des Moines on the following Thursday afternoon, her feet blistered from walking countless city blocks, and her mind overflowing with memories she knew would sustain her through many Iowa winters to come, Margaret felt fundamentally transformed in ways both subtle and profound. She had navigated the labyrinthine subway system without getting lost, reading the colored maps with their complex interchanges and transfer points, hailed a taxi with the confident gesture she had observed other women using, ordered dinner in restaurants where the waiters wore crisp white shirts with black bow ties and spoke with accents she could barely understand, but that sounded sophisticated and worldly. She had proven to herself that she was capable of far more than classroom management and grading multiplication tables, that the world was larger and more complex and more wonderful than she had ever imagined from her small corner of Iowa. Back in Des Moines, where winter was beginning to assert itself with cold winds that rattled the windows of her house on Maple Street, she fell into her familiar routines with a mixture of relief at their comfortable predictability and melancholy at the adventure's end. Her students greeted her return with enthusiastic questions and eager faces, wanting to know if she had seen the Statue of Liberty up close, if people in New York really talked as fast as they did in movies, if the buildings were truly as tall as everyone said. And she promised them a special presentation with photographs once her film was developed. She dropped off the precious roll at Woolworth's on Saturday morning, handing it to the clerk behind the photo counter with careful instructions for double prints, and the young woman with permed hair and bright lipstick told her the prints would be ready by Tuesday at the latest, Wednesday at the most if they were particularly busy. Tuesday afternoon arrived cold and grey, with clouds threatening snow that would not actually fall until evening. Margaret picked up her photographs during her lunch break, driving her aging Ford sedan carefully through streets slick with early ice, the envelope feeling substantial and promising in her hands when the clerk retrieved it from the alphabetically organized bins behind the counter, heavy with the double prints she had requested and the tangible weight of her New York memories. She paid the bill of $3.75, expensive but worth every penny, she told herself, and resisted the urge to open the envelope immediately in the store like an excited child. Instead, she drove back to her small house on Maple Street, with its familiar white picket fence and dormant flower beds, made herself a proper cup of tea in her mother's china teapot that she rarely used anymore, and settled at her kitchen table to review her vacation memories in the quiet comfort of her home. The first photographs were exactly as she remembered them, each image a portal back to those magical days in Manhattan. The Metropolitan Museum's grand facade, with its imposing columns and broad steps crowded with visitors. Central Park's autumn colors, captured in shades of gold and orange and deep red that reminded her why October was her favorite month. The automats gleaming chrome and glass reflecting the customers, lined up with their quarters and nickels ready. She smiled at each one, already imagining how she would arrange them in the photo album she had purchased specifically for this trip, already planning the stories she would tell her class about each location and experience. The Empire State Building photographs came midway through the stack, and Margaret paused at the one showing the Chrysler Building. In the foreground, perfectly framed despite her intention to exclude them, stood the two men from the observation deck. The image was remarkably clear for an accidental photograph. She could see the taller man's profile, partially shadowed by his fedora, and the shorter man reaching for the envelope. The timing had been perfect, capturing the exact moment of the exchange. Margaret studied the photograph more closely. Something about the taller man's face nagged at her, a sense of recognition she could not quite place. She set the photograph aside and continued through the stack, but her mind kept returning to that image. Where had she seen that face before? That evening, she pulled out her collection of Life magazines. Margaret saved every issue, storing them in chronological order in her basement. She could not explain what she was looking for, only that some instinct drove her to search. She started with the most recent issues and worked backward, scanning photographs of politicians, actors, criminals, anyone whose face might match the man from the observation deck. She found it in an issue from April 1956, more than a year old. The photograph accompanied an article about suspected Soviet espionage activities in the United States. The article discussed the case of a defected Soviet intelligence officer who had provided information about KGB operations in America. Among the photographs was one showing several men identified as potential Soviet operatives, their faces provided by the defector from memory and rendered by a police sketch artist. One of the sketches bore an unmistakable resemblance to the tall man from the Empire State Building. The caption identified him as possibly being Yuri Volkov, a suspected Soviet intelligence officer, believed to be operating under diplomatic cover in New York. The article noted that the FBI was seeking information about his whereabouts and activities. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the photograph from the Empire State Building in one hand and the Life magazine in the other, her heart pounding. This had to be a coincidence. Surely she was seeing patterns where none existed, letting her imagination run wild after reading too many espionage novels. The resemblance could be entirely accidental. New York had millions of residents. The chances that she had accidentally photographed a Soviet spy were infinitesimal, but the image would not leave her mind. Over the next few days, she found herself returning to the photograph repeatedly, comparing it to the sketch in the magazine. The profile was nearly identical, the same sharp nose, the same angular jaw. Even the way the man held himself, shoulders slightly hunched as though perpetually guarding against observation, matched the description in the article. Finally, on Friday evening, Margaret made a decision. She would contact the FBI. If she was wrong, if this was merely a case of mistaken identity and an overactive imagination, they would tell her so. She would feel foolish for a few days and then forget the entire matter. But if she was right, if she had accidentally photographed something significant, then surely the authorities should know. The Des Moines FBI office was located in the Federal Building downtown. Margaret had never been inside, had never had any reason to interact with federal law enforcement. The very idea filled her with anxiety. She spent Saturday morning rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain without sounding like a hysterical woman who saw spies lurking behind every corner. On Monday afternoon, she drove to the Federal Building during her lunch break. The FBI office was on the 3rd floor, accessed through a door marked only with the agency's initials. Margaret stood in the hallway for a full 2 minutes, gathering her courage before finally pushing the door open. The reception area was small and utilitarian, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. A young woman sat behind the desk, typing with impressive speed on a manual typewriter. She looked up as Margaret entered, her expression professionally neutral. Margaret introduced herself and explained, haltingly, that she believed she might have accidentally photographed someone the FBI was seeking. The receptionist listened without expression, then asked Margaret to wait while she consulted with an agent. She disappeared through an interior door, leaving Margaret alone in the reception area. 10 minutes passed. 15. Margaret was beginning to think she had made a terrible mistake when the interior door opened again and a man emerged. He was perhaps 35, with close-cropped brown hair and eyes that assessed Margaret in a single glance. He introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Thornton and invited her into his office. Thornton's office was as spare as the reception area, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. A single window overlooked the street below. He gestured for Margaret to sit and settled himself behind the desk, his hands folded on the surface. Margaret explained her story from the beginning, trying to keep her voice steady. She described her vacation, the visit to the Empire State Building, the accidental photograph. She produced both the photograph and the Life magazine, laying them side by side on Thornton's desk. Thornton studied both items in silence. His face revealed nothing. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at Margaret and asked a series of questions. What time had she taken the photograph? What day? Had she noticed anything else about the 2 men? Had they spoken? Had they noticed her taking the photograph? Could she describe the shorter man in more detail? Margaret answered as best she could, frustrated by how little she had actually observed. She had been focused on her photography, not on espionage. The shorter man had been unremarkable, she explained. Medium height, brown hair, perhaps in his 40s. She had not heard them speak. They had not noticed her. Thornton made notes in a small notebook, his handwriting rapid and precise. When he finished, he thanked Margaret for coming forward and said the Bureau would investigate the matter. He asked if he could keep the photograph, and Margaret agreed, though she felt a small pang of loss. It had been one of her better accidental shots. She left the federal building feeling deflated. Thornton had been professional, but gave no indication whether he considered her information valuable or merely the imaginings of an overzealous citizen. She told herself she had done her civic duty and tried to put the matter out of her mind. 3 weeks passed. Margaret heard nothing from the FBI and gradually convinced herself that her suspicions had been unfounded. The photograph had shown nothing more than 2 businessmen conducting a routine transaction. She had wasted Agent Thornton's time and her own, and the whole episode was best forgotten. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early December, her doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Agent Thornton standing on her porch, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He asked if he might come in, and Margaret, bewildered, ushered him into her living room. Thornton settled onto her sofa and withdrew a notebook from his coat pocket. What he told her over the next 30 minutes fundamentally altered Margaret's understanding of her accidental photograph. The FBI had indeed investigated her information, Thornton explained. The man she had identified as possibly being Yuri Volkov was, in fact, Volkov. He was a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover as a cultural attaché at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. The Bureau had been aware of him for some time, but had been unable to prove he was engaged in espionage activities beyond his diplomatic duties. The photograph Margaret had taken was significant for 2 reasons. First, it placed Volkov at a location outside his normal patterns of movement on a specific date and time. Second, and more importantly, it showed him making what appeared to be a brush pass, a classic espionage technique for transferring materials without drawing attention. The shorter man, Thornton continued, had been more difficult to identify. The FBI had enhanced Margaret's photograph, enlarging it until they could make out additional details. They had compared the enhanced image against files of known and suspected Soviet assets, and eventually found a match. His name was David Fisher, and he was a naturalized American citizen who worked as a translator at the United Nations. Fisher had emigrated from Austria in 1946, part of the massive wave of displaced persons seeking refuge in America after the war. He had impeccable credentials, spoke 6 languages fluently, and had passed multiple background checks during his 11 years of government employment. But the FBI, working with information provided by recent defectors, had developed suspicions about Fisher. His background story, though documented, had inconsistencies. His stated birthplace in Austria had no records matching his claimed identity. His stated university credentials could not be fully verified. The defectors had mentioned an operative using the code name Translator who matched Fisher's general description. Margaret's photograph had given the FBI what they needed, proof that Fisher was meeting covertly with a known Soviet intelligence officer. This was not the behavior of an innocent translator. Armed with this evidence, the Bureau had begun intensive surveillance of Fisher. The surveillance had borne fruit quickly. Fisher met with Volkov twice more over the following weeks, each time using classic counter-surveillance techniques to ensure he was not being followed. He varied his routes, used public transportation, stopped suddenly to check reflections in shop windows. These were not the habits of an innocent man. The FBI had also begun examining Fisher's work product. As a translator, he had access to countless documents, correspondence, and conversations at the United Nations. Many of these materials were sensitive, dealing with international negotiations, diplomatic strategies, and policy positions. It was a treasure trove of information for Soviet intelligence. But the Bureau needed more than surveillance footage and suspicious behavior. They needed evidence that Fisher was actually transmitting classified information to the Soviets. They needed to catch him in the act. Thornton explained that the FBI had developed a plan. They would feed Fisher specific false information designed to be tantalizing but ultimately harmless. This information would be inserted into documents Fisher would naturally encounter in his work. If the Soviets acted on this information, it would confirm Fisher was their source. The operation took weeks to execute. The false information concerned supposed American negotiating positions on disarmament talks. It was detailed enough to seem authentic, valuable enough to interest the Soviets, but ultimately harmless to actual American interests. The documents containing this information were carefully placed where Fisher would encounter them during his normal translation work. The FBI waited and watched. Fisher continued his meetings with Volkov, each one recorded by Bureau surveillance teams. Then, in late November, Soviet diplomats suddenly shifted their negotiating positions in a way that precisely reflected the false information the FBI had planted. The trap had worked. On December 1st, 1957, the FBI arrested David Fisher as he left his apartment in Queens. Agents executed a search warrant and found a treasure trove of espionage materials, coded messages, microfilm, a shortwave radio for receiving transmissions, and detailed notes on United Nations operations. In his bedroom closet, hidden inside a hollowed-out book, they found nearly $15,000 in cash. Fisher confessed within hours of his arrest. He was not Austrian, he admitted, but East German. Soviet intelligence had created his entire background, providing him with forged documents and a fabricated history. He had been recruited in 1945, trained in espionage tradecraft, and inserted into the displaced persons stream that flooded into America after the war. His mission was simple: gain employment where he could access valuable information and report everything to his Soviet handlers. For 11 years, Fisher had done exactly that. He had provided the Soviets with thousands of pages of documents, summaries of confidential conversations, and insights into American diplomatic strategies. The damage to American interests was substantial, though Thornton assured Margaret that nothing Fisher had transmitted had compromised national security in any immediate military sense. The Soviets had gained advantages in negotiations, certainly, but they had not learned missile trajectories or battle plans. Volkov, as a diplomatic officer, could not be arrested. He had diplomatic immunity, but the State Department declared him persona non grata, and he was expelled from the United States within 48 hours of Fisher's arrest. Two other Soviet officials at the UN, identified through Fisher's confession as intelligence officers, were also expelled. Thornton looked at Margaret with something approaching wonder as he finished his account. Her accidental photograph, he said, had triggered an investigation that dismantled a Soviet intelligence network that had operated successfully for over a decade. Without that image, without her decision to contact the FBI despite her doubts, Fisher might have continued his espionage for years more. Margaret sat in her living room, trying to process what she had heard. She had gone to New York seeking nothing more than a week of tourism and pleasant memories. Instead, she had accidentally become part of an espionage case that would, Thornton said, remain classified for decades. The FBI requested that Margaret say nothing about the case to anyone. The arrest would be reported in newspapers, certainly, but her role in it would remain secret. This was partly for her own protection, Thornton explained, but also because the FBI did not want to reveal all of its investigative methods. Margaret agreed readily. Who would she tell? Who would believe her if she did? Thornton stood to leave but paused at the door. He told Margaret that the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover himself, had been briefed on the case and had specifically noted the value of her vigilant citizenship. A letter of commendation would be placed in a classified file, Thornton said, though Margaret would never be able to show it to anyone. It was a secret honor, invisible to the world but real nonetheless. After Thornton left, Margaret sat alone in her living room for a long time. Outside, snow had begun to fall, coating her street in white. Her neighbors were decorating for Christmas, hanging lights and wreaths, going about their ordinary lives. They had no idea that the quiet schoolteacher at number 17 Maple Street had helped expose a Soviet spy. Over the following weeks, Margaret read the newspaper accounts of Fisher's arrest with a strange sense of disconnection. The articles described him as a Soviet agent who had infiltrated the United Nations, providing classified information to his handlers for over a decade. His arrest came after a lengthy FBI investigation, the article said, without mentioning what had triggered that investigation. No photographer from Iowa was mentioned, no accidental tourist snapshot. Margaret's role in the case remained entirely classified. Fisher was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The trial revealed the extent of his espionage, the thousands of documents he had photographed and transmitted, the regular payments he had received from his Soviet handlers, but it did not reveal how the FBI had first identified him as a suspect. That detail remained protected. Margaret returned to her classroom after Christmas break, teaching her fifth graders about the solar system, the capitals of Europe, the proper use of commas. She shared her vacation photographs with them, carefully excluding the one she had given to the FBI. The children gasped at the images of the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty, the bustling streets of Manhattan. They asked if she had seen any movie stars, any famous people. Margaret smiled and said no. She had only seen ordinary New Yorkers going about their daily lives. But sometimes, during quiet moments, Margaret would think about that October morning on the observation deck. She thought about how easily she might have framed her photograph differently, excluding the two men entirely. She thought about how close she had come to throwing away the photograph without really examining it. She thought about her hesitation before calling the FBI, her conviction that she was being foolish, that she was wasting everyone's time. The incident taught Margaret something fundamental about the nature of vigilance and citizenship. The great battles of the Cold War were not always fought by soldiers and spies in distant places. Sometimes they were fought by ordinary people who paid attention, who trusted their instincts, who had the courage to speak up even when they felt foolish. She also understood in a way she never had before the hidden dimensions of the world around her. How many other people in Des Moines, in every city and town across America, were not what they seemed? How many covert operations, secret exchanges, clandestine meetings were occurring in plain sight, invisible to those who did not know to look for them? The Cold War, Margaret realized, was not something that happened only in Berlin or Moscow or Washington. It was happening everywhere, all the time, a vast shadow conflict waged through deception and intelligence gathering. And ordinary citizens, through nothing more than accident and attention, could become part of that conflict. In the spring of 1958, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from the Department of State thanking her for her service to her country. The letter was carefully worded, revealing nothing specific, but its meaning was clear. Someone in the government had taken note of what she had done. Margaret framed the letter and hung it in her bedroom, where only she could see it. It became her private reminder that she had, in her own small way, made a difference, that her ordinary life had intersected with history in a manner she could never have predicted. Years passed. The Cold War continued, punctuated by crises and conflicts that dominated headlines: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the Vietnam War. Margaret watched these events from Des Moines, teaching her students, grading papers, living her quiet life. She never spoke about her role in the Fisher case, honoring the FBI's request for secrecy. David Fisher served 16 years of his sentence before being exchanged for an American intelligence officer captured by the Soviets. He returned to East Germany and disappeared from public view. Yuri Volkov, expelled from the United States, continued his career in Soviet intelligence, eventually rising to a senior position in the KGB's Foreign Operations Directorate. Margaret never took another vacation to New York. She told herself it was because she had already seen what she wanted to see, but perhaps it was something more. That trip had been transformative in ways she had not anticipated, and she was not certain she wanted to risk such transformation again. She preferred her quiet life, her predictable routines, her sense of safety and order. But she kept her camera, and she continued taking photographs. Nothing so dramatic as Soviet spies, of course. Just the ordinary scenes of her ordinary life, her students, her garden, the changing seasons in Des Moines. And sometimes, when she reviewed her photographs, she would pause and study the backgrounds, the incidental people captured at the edges of her frames, wondering if perhaps she had accidentally photographed something significant without realizing it. Agent Thornton visited Margaret one more time in the fall of 1963 to inform her that the Fisher case had been reviewed for possible declassification. Her role, however, would remain classified for the foreseeable future. National security required it, he explained apologetically. Margaret assured him she understood and had no desire for public recognition. She had done what any responsible citizen would do, nothing more. After Thornton left, Margaret reflected on how strange it was that the most significant thing she had ever done would remain forever secret. No one would ever know that the quiet schoolteacher from Des Moines had helped expose a Soviet spy ring. There would be no medals, no public ceremonies, no place in the history books. Just a classified file in some government archive, gathering dust. And yet, Margaret found she was content with that. She had learned that significance is not measured by recognition, but by impact. Her accidental photograph had protected her country, had ended a spy's career, had contributed in some small way to the vast struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. That knowledge was enough. It had to be enough. The photograph itself, the one she had given to the FBI, was eventually returned to her in 1979, more than 20 years after she had taken it. It arrived in a manila envelope with no return address, accompanied by a brief note stating that the image was no longer needed for evidentiary purposes. By then, Margaret was retired from teaching, living alone in the same house on Maple Street, her life much as it had always been. She looked at the photograph with older eyes, seeing it differently now. The two men frozen in their moment of conspiracy, unaware that they were being captured on film, unaware that a schoolteacher from Iowa was about to change both their lives. There was something almost sad about it, Margaret thought. They had been so careful, so professional, and yet a single accidental photograph had undone all their precautions. Margaret placed the photograph in a drawer and did not look at it again. The past was past, and she had no desire to dwell on it. She had lived through the moment, had played her part, and that was sufficient. When Margaret Holloway passed away in 1989 at the age of 75, her obituary in the Des Moines Register described her as a beloved teacher who had dedicated her life to educating children. It mentioned her 40 years of service at Roosevelt Elementary, her perfect attendance record, her gentle manner with difficult students. It said nothing about espionage, nothing about the FBI, nothing about a vacation photograph that had exposed a Soviet spy. Her effects were sorted by a niece who had inherited the house. Most items went to charity: clothing, books, kitchen goods. The photographs were boxed up to be distributed among family members. The niece found the Empire State Building photograph in a drawer and nearly threw it away. It was poorly framed, she thought, with two men blocking the view of the Chrysler Building. But something made her keep it. Some instinct she could not name. She placed it in her own collection, where it remains to this day, its significance unknown to its owner. The full story of Margaret Holloway's role in exposing the Fisher spy ring was finally declassified in 2008, more than 50 years after the events occurred. The documents were released as part of a routine declassification review of Cold War intelligence files. A researcher at the National Archives discovered them and wrote a brief article for an academic journal, bringing Margaret's story to light for the first time. The article generated little attention. The Cold War had been over for nearly 2 decades. The passions and fears that had driven it had faded into history. A story about a schoolteacher accidentally photographing a spy in 1957 seemed quaint, almost amusing, a relic of a distant era. But for those who read the article carefully, who understood the context and the stakes, Margaret's story represented something profound. It demonstrated that in the great ideological struggles that define eras, the difference between success and failure can hinge on the smallest accidents, the most unlikely observations. That vigilance is not the exclusive province of professional intelligence officers, but the responsibility of every citizen. That ordinary people, through nothing more than attention and courage, can change the course of history. Margaret never knew that her story would eventually be told. She died believing her role would remain classified forever, a secret honor visible only to herself and a few FBI agents. Perhaps that would have pleased her. She had never sought recognition, never wanted to be anything other than what she was, a teacher, a citizen, a woman who had done her duty when circumstances demanded it. The photograph that started it all, the accidental image that exposed a Soviet spy ring, has never been publicly released. It remains in classified FBI files, available only to researchers with appropriate security clearances. Those who have seen it describe it as unremarkable. Two men on an observation deck, one passing an envelope to the other, the Manhattan skyline stretched behind them. Nothing in the image itself suggests its significance. It is only context, only knowledge of what came after, that transforms it from a tourist's mistake into a historical document. And that perhaps is the final lesson of Margaret Holloway's story. Significance is not always visible in the moment. The most important photographs are not always the ones we carefully compose, but sometimes the ones we capture by accident. History is not made only by those who seek to make it, but also by those who simply happen to be in the right place, with the right tool at the right time, and have the wisdom to recognize what they have witnessed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.